let's start off with your background. You have been studying policing for how long?
Well, really for about 30 years now. So I started at the San Francisco Coalition on Homelessness around 1990 and was really working on housing issues at that time. But that was when we were beginning to see this uptick in police harassment of homeless folks. And my boss at the time asked me to look into this. And that was really the beginnings of broken windows policing. The idea that we could use police to micromanage the behaviors of folks, and that somehow this would magically cause there to be fewer homicides, which homeless people were not committing any homicides. So what it really was, what became really clear, because I was coming at this from a housing perspective, was that the city of San Francisco had given up on the possibility of actually housing people and was just going to turn the problem over to the police to manage.
Yeah. So we will get into the kind of like creep of what the police are expected to do. But something I thought was so fascinating about this book was there's been a lot of discussion about how multicultural these recent protests have been and how they've taken on a kind of anti-capitalist bent. And you offered some really illuminating history about the origins of police and policings in the end of policing. And I'd heard a lot before I read the book about the connection between the origin of police and slavery. But I knew a lot less about how police were meant to tamp down the working classes. They were meant to preserve the power of the moneyed elite. So could you talk a little bit more about that?
Sure. So what I like to think of is that policing is a state tool that facilitates and allows regimes of exploitation to continue to move forward. And in the 19th century, when most police forces are formed, those primary systems of exploitation were things like colonialism and slavery, but also industrialization. Yeah. So in a place like London, it doesn't really make sense to link policing to slavery. Britain's slavery is happening in the West Indies. It's not happening in London. That was about shaping this population that's flooding into London into a stable and docile working class by breaking their unions, suppressing strike activity, but also micromanaging their everyday behavior. And we can see this also in a lot of Northern American cities. So eventually, Northern police do take on a role of slave catching, and as Northern cities become more racially diverse, of course, police play a major role in maintaining the color line. But initial formation of policing in places like Boston, Chicago, and New York in the early to mid 1800s was really about class politics. But of course, when we go to the South and we look at the big cities of the South like Charleston and Savannah and New Orleans, policing emerges in direct relationship to slavery. It's about managing what is really a mobile slave population in these cities, because in the big cities, slaves worked outside the homes of their owners in the kind of newly industrializing Southern economy. And so they're on the move. It's not like being on a plantation with an overseer and everyone's stuck in one place and you can have slave patrols, minding the roadways. There's actually the majority of people on the streets in a place like Charleston are Black people, and whites are terrified of this, and they need policing to create their idea of what security is.
Yeah. So when you see all different kinds of people, all different groups, and a lot of the people of those groups being from working class backgrounds, is that surprising for you in this current moment of protest?
Well, it is a little surprising because it's not exactly like this is the organized labor movement that's out in the streets. I think it's really about the rise of a deeper left political analysis among young people in the United States that we can see expressed in like the popularity of Bernie Sanders and Democratic Socialists of America. And what's been encouraging is that this new left politics has a pretty decent racial justice analysis.
Yeah.
that includes police and prison abolition as a kind of founding principle. So they didn't need to be explained about this. They had already been doing this work. And I've seen this firsthand over the last 3 years, crisscrossing the country. I've been in about 25 cities a year and speaking to a lot of young white audiences who are trying to figure out how to relate to these movements around police and prison abolition and racial justice.
So, what do you think has caused that? I mean, a lot of people would point to social media and the internet. Do you think that's it?
No, I think that's just a reflection of it. I don't think it's causing it. I think that the popularity of this socialist analysis is tied to the failure of the leadership of both political parties to do anything to address fundamental problems. I mean, what's going on with the environment, what's going on with growing economic inequality, what's going on with corruption in our political system, and of course, what's going on with issues of racial inequality and mass criminalization. And in some ways, it's like the coming together of Occupy Wall Street and Black Lives Matter.
Yeah, yeah. So something that you just alluded to in that intro and what you talk about in the book is the expansion of policing. So could you discuss a little bit about the things that police are expected to do now that they did not have to do in the past?
Right. So we talked a second ago about this kind of 200-year history of problematic policing. But then we've got this extra layer of criminalization and mass incarceration that's happened over the last 40 to 50 years. So I think there's a lot more awareness about the mass incarceration part, thanks to folks like Michelle Alexander, who explained so clearly about this rise from 200,000 prisoners to 2.2 million in a very short period of time after a long period of stability. And really, no one goes to prison who hasn't first been arrested by police. So what we've seen is that there's been also at the same time this expansion of the scope and intensity of policing. And really it's tied to this issue of regimes of exploitation. So, we don't exactly have slavery and colonialism today, 13th Amendment aside, right? What we have is this kind of neoliberal austerity politics, which is producing this tremendous inequality and is leaving huge numbers of people out of the global economy. So it's producing mass homelessness and mass untreated mental illness and substance abuse problems, mass involvement in black markets of drugs and sex work and stolen goods, because folks don't have access to real economic participation. And then those problems have been turned over to the police to manage. So when the schools fail, we put in school police. When there's an opioid overdose crisis, we intensify narcotics policing. When there are no mental health services, we send the police to respond to mental health crisis calls. And that's really the root of this problem here, is this turning of every social problem, which was created by politicians. Then those politicians turn those problems over to the police to manage, so they don't have to really address the root of the issue.
Yeah. And something you also get at is the police are expected to do all these things and they're not that great at it.
Right. Well, police are violence workers.
Yeah.
I mean, that's what distinguishes them from all other parts of government. And so if you don't want violence, you shouldn't get the police involved. If we don't want violence directed at our children in schools, don't get the police involved. If you don't want violence in your home when your son is having a mental health crisis, don't get the police involved. So there's when the police have gotten involved in all these things, then there is violence. And then people say, oh my God, there's too much violence. We need to give them special training to be less violent. But this doesn't make any sense, because the whole point is they're violence workers. You can't train them not to be violence workers. And to the extent that we're trying to turn them into social workers or counselors, we should just hire social workers and counselors.
Yeah. Yeah. And I just realized I use like the euphemism not great. I mean, they're actively they're bad. Like they're actually creating more harm. It's like really what I probably should have said there. Yeah. Um,
Now is a
so
moment. Now is a moment when we don't have to pull our punches.
yeah, yeah. I was like, oh, well, let's be honest, right? Like we're seeing what we're seeing out in the streets right now is a reflection of how actually deleterious the stuff that they are engaging in is. So I wanted to talk about that reform part. So we recently saw the rise and fall of the 8 Can't Wait campaign. Did you get a chance to see
Of
what that
course.
was? Okay, okay.
Yeah, I
So
know those guys.
okay, yeah. So just for people who might not be familiar, so um, Campaign Zero, led by DeRay McKesson, laid out these suggestions for 8 things police should do to be better. And it seems like a big problem with that is that a lot of the major police departments have already adopted many, if not all of those reforms, and they're still out here brutalizing people. So is my sense of that correct? I mean, you know, you mentioned early on in the book that reform is probably not going to do it. Do you think that there are those kinds of targeted reforms that we could suggest that could fundamentally alter what they do?
So the short answer is no. Most of these reforms have not worked, and they can't work because they misunderstand the nature of the problem.
Yeah.
Now, some are better and worse than others, and some might provide some reduction in the violence if implemented. But this idea that we can substantially reduce the violence in policing, I think, is misguided.
Yeah.
And some of the reforms, especially those that came out of the Obama administration, are just laughable. Things
Yeah.
like implicit bias training, which is included in the new House Justice Bill, Policing and Justice Bill. You know, this is just patently ridiculous. It imagines that the problems of race and policing are completely unconscious and unintentional, you know, misaligned behavior by a few individual officers. I mean, we got a problem of explicit racism in American policing.
Yeah.
But also the racism is baked into the political decision to turn the problems of Black and brown communities over to the police to manage. And so it doesn't really matter what the individual officer's attitude is or what their unconscious bias is. And we have an ocean of research that shows that the race of officers has almost no impact on communities. It just doesn't help. I wish it did. I wish it were that simple, but it just isn't. You
Yeah,
know?
so I found that to be so fascinating because we hear so much about community policing and hire more police of color and Black police and brown police. And what I did not know before reading this was that often when you look at the misconduct sheets of Black police officers, often they have a worse history of misconduct than their white peers. Is that true?
It is sometimes true. It is sometimes true. Now, there's a few new studies that have come out just in the last year, long after I finished writing the book, that, you know, they show some areas where there might be some benefit to having Black police officers in Black neighborhoods, but the effects are really quite small, and it just doesn't get in, you know, it doesn't address the fact that a totally lawful, procedurally proper, unbiased, low-level drug arrest is still going to ruin some young person's life for no good reason.
Right.
It does not make them safer. It does not make the community safer. It does not prevent anyone from getting drugs, right? It's just an extra burden on Black and brown communities that their young people are ending up in the criminal justice system instead of getting access to jobs and decent housing and healthcare and things like that.
Mm-hmm. I also assume that you saw Joe Biden, the statement and the suggestions that he put forth about the community policing stuff and the throwing money into police and training. What I guess I have a question about is why do so many Democratic politicians put forth these suggestions when there is such a large body of research about why the stuff that they are suggesting will not work. I mean, we have so much data
Yeah.
on it. Why do we keep returning to the same failed policies?
So this is why it's so important that we have a political economic analysis about policing. Because when we understand that the problem of over policing is about solving a set of political problems, then we see why politicians are committed to not really doing anything about it. So what I mean by that is, right, the decision to use government to push resources up the economic ladder to subsidize these already most successful parts of society, tax breaks to corporations, these downtown real estate deals with all the insider trading and stuff that goes along with that. Both parties are committed to that kind of economic program that led to all these problems that are now being policed. So, and this includes the Black Congressional Caucus, this includes big city Democratic mayors. They want to make their downtown real estate deals. And they get big campaign contributions to do this. And policing makes it possible for them to get away with it. And so they don't want to dial back policing because that would require that they actually divert resources from these deals into actually lifting up communities and creating more, equality and stability in people's lives. So the only way they can approach this is to tinker at the margins with some little superficial papering over of the problem. Can you just please shoot fewer Black people so it doesn't create such a political problem for us? Mm-hmm. And if you listen to the language coming from both parties, even Trump, when he announced his executive order, it's all about how can we restore trust in police? How can we get the community to trust the police? Like it's our fault, that we don't trust the police. Yeah. And it's just a manipulation of perceptions, and it's not doing anything to produce racial or economic justice.
Right. Oh, Professor Vitale, it sounds like, you're talking some abolitionist talk here. Do you consider yourself to be a prison abolitionist?
Definitely. I want to live in a world where safety doesn't come from people with guns and putting people in cages. Yeah. And I think that analysis, right, that desire combined with this historical analysis of policing and prisons playing a role in reproducing inequality, what that does is it helps guide our work in ways that allow us to avoid certain mistakes around embracing reforms that turn out to be superficial and ineffective, because we have a better analysis of the problem.
Yeah. So phrases like abolish the police and defund the police are very scary for people, even for people of color, Black people who understand that this is basically a regime of brutality that we live under. It's really easy to fearmonger around that. But people are not saying we should shut down the police tomorrow, right? So could you talk a little bit about the strategies of divest and invest?
If you know where that magic switch is that can eliminate all police tomorrow, I'm sure there's some people who would be interested in trying to flip it, but there's no such switch, right? There's no city council in the United States that's going to zero out the police budget this year. So that, people who suggest that, they're the ones who are being naive and really disingenuous, right? They're not actually interested in listening to what we have to say a lot of the time. They're trying to come up with arguments about why we can't have what we want. This is a movement that is led by people who have experienced a profound lack of safety in their lives. If you look at the mostly Black women leading this movement, they have been the victims of domestic violence, of interpersonal violence, and police violence. And what they're looking for is a way to actually enhance public safety, especially in those places that have historically been abandoned, or worse, have had state violence imposed upon them. And they have ideas based in evidence and examples about how to enhance safety better than relying on armed police. But the challenge is for decades, these communities have been told you only have one option to produce safety, and that's more police, more incarceration. So, people have capitulated to this. If our choice is nothing or police to deal with a violence problem or, a serious disorder problem or poverty, then some people are going to choose police out of desperation. And my hope is that this moment is really opening up the political possibility enough for people to start asking for what they really want. Because almost everyone who says we need more police also, and this has been my experience doing this work for decades, right, is that they also want a better youth center for their kids. They also want safe housing. They also want better schools for their kids, right? But they've been told they can't have any of those things. And so they quit asking for them in a lot of cases. Now is the time to ask for what we really want. To put that out on the table and quit limiting ourselves to things that we think we can get in a system that's hostile to us. Because that's what a lot of these reforms are. They're little incremental things that people said, well, we can't really get the boot off my neck, but maybe we can at least get a couple of black police officers hired, and maybe we can get them to do some special training. But that's not going to fix the problem.
Yeah. So if we chose to divest from the police forces, what would that look like?
Right. So if you look at the movements that are underway around the country that were all happening before Minneapolis, right? This is about going to budget hearings and lobbying city council members to shift spending from police and jails and youth lockups to community identified public safety initiatives. Things like community-based anti-violence centers, domestic violence shelters and counseling services, more real mental health services for people in their community, real access to high quality medical drug treatment, more counselors and social workers in the schools, right? They're very concrete things that people are trying to win through normal political processes.
So the big thing that comes up when we try to have these conversations is, okay, so a lot of people agree that a lot of our crime, maybe most of our crime, could be eliminated if we invested in different kinds of institutions in these countries, the mental health stuff, as you said, education, giving people equitable employment, like fair wage. But do you think that there's always going to be a population of people who are just dangerous, homicidal, prone to violence, want to dominate? And if you think that they're going to be there, then what happens to those people?
Right. So any system is going to have harm. Any system is going to have harm. And we do need structures to try to manage those harms. Policing has not done a very good job of that, right? Policing is usually what happens after the harms have already occurred. And then we start trying to figure out how to punish people. Mm-hmm. No system is going to be perfect. There's no world where no harms are going to occur. What we're trying to get to is a world where there are many fewer harms than we currently have. People will say, well, what about school shootings? Yeah, what about all those school shootings? We got an ocean of police in our society, and yet people keep shooting up our schools. Maybe it's time to try something different. Yeah. And as we do that, we dial back our reliance on policing and we see what's left. And we work on that. And we try to build to this better future, right? But it does not start with zeroing out policing. It starts with investing in communities, investing in fixing these problems in ways that allow us to reduce the harms that come with turning things over to the police.
Yeah. So this is so interesting. I have so many conversations with Black women, and a lot of their primary concern is about violence, violence in the home, violence in their communities. And a lot of that is gun violence, right? And it's like police aren't really going to be able to do anything as long as our gun laws are the way that they are, as long as access to firearms is so widespread. But still, people want to feel like there is a barrier once those firearms have been acquired between themselves and the potential danger. How do we kind of bridge the understanding that, like, it's not doing what you think it's doing?
Well, there are a couple things here. I mean, first, I'm all for reducing the number of guns in society. And on the supply side, that means things like, gun control legislation, restrictions on and manufacture of firearms. I think that's going to be really difficult to accomplish, but I'm for it. But it doesn't address the demand side. Why are people picking up guns? And mostly it's out of insecurity. People carry guns defensively, and then they get used in all kinds of different ways: suicides, domestic violence, road rage incidents, accidental shootings, right? So what can we do to drive down the desire to have all these guns? I mean, when we look at whites, right, it's racism is a big part of it, right? It's fear of the other. They're stockpiling weapons. Whenever there's a rise in civil rights activity, gun sales go up.
Yeah. Right.
In the Black community, there are also real problems of insecurity, right? The police are not able to produce the kind of security that would allow people to reduce their reliance on carrying guns. Also, a big factor in this is drugs. The war on drugs, drug prohibition, has created this massive underground black market economy where disputes are settled with guns and where there's a constant risk of robbery and no ability to, call on the legal system. So people are carrying around guns, and then somebody looks at somebody funny or cuts someone off on the road, and that gun is handy and it gets used. So we need to look at violence interruption strategies to work with young people to break that cycle of violence, to help them feel more secure, more connected to their communities, less alienated. One of the things we know about youth violence is that almost every young person who is involved in committing an act of serious violence has been the victim of serious violence. Mm. And that trauma, that experience never gets addressed until they go out and commit violence, and then they're incarcerated, which just throws them into a world with even more violence. So we got to break that cycle, and we have evidence-based strategies for doing that have shown real success in reducing homicides, reducing shootings, and reducing gun carrying. And we need to give those strategies a chance.
Yeah. Not to put you on the spot or anything, but can you name off the top of your head a community, a city where divesting from police and investing in other kind of community programs has done something meaningful to reduce the amount of violence?
So the problem, right, is that we're in the middle of a long-term trend of increasing policing. Yeah. So we've not been given a chance. But having said that, in New York, we have a cure violence program, and we did a very high quality study where we picked neighborhoods with similar demographic characteristics around race and age and income, and we gave one of them a cure violence site, which is, hiring people from the community to work with young people in a really intensive way, give them access to services and pathways to employment, and then neighborhoods that just had policing. And the cure violence sites saw 50% higher reductions in shootings and homicides than the non-cure violence sites, the policing only sites. Now, that didn't involve a dialing back of policing. And what we hear from the cure violence workers is that they're still having to deal with the police, and that is actually making their job more difficult.
Wow. 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 I've recently heard people mention Camden, New Jersey as a space where moving away from traditional policing has worked. Do you know anything about that?
So Camden is tricky. I mean, Camden is certainly not what I'm proposing. Camden was in part about breaking the union there so that they could bring in more officers at lower pay with no work rules so that they could have them work crazy shifts and stuff. And arrests in Camden have actually gone up.
Mm.
More people are getting arrested. It's an intensification of policing, but it's being done, in this highly community policing oriented style. So people's perceptions have improved, and there have been some reductions in crime, which may in part be because the corruption of the old police force has been taken out of the equation, and people have kind of hit the reset button. But the police in Camden have now formed their own union, and the crime declines are not really continuing. And I suspect we'll be right back where we started in a few years, unless there's a major effort to actually invest in community-based solutions.
Oh, that's depressing. So this
Yeah.
brings me to something that I wanted to talk about. So I do consider myself to be pro-labor, but it really seems like police unions are a huge reason why meaningful reform just won't happen. I've frankly been really disturbed by the public statements from the SBA, the Sergeants Benevolent Association in New York. Like the things that they just tweet, or whoever is behind that account, and other unions across the country, they just have no couth. It is very strange to me. Do you think it would be possible to work with police unions so that they might reel themselves in a bit?
I think if we just gave them some implicit bias training, that would fix it. I mean, these unions are straight up racist. There's just no other way to understand the discourse that's coming out of a lot of these unions. And they actively defend officers accused of racist misconduct. They cover up the racism on the chat boards, the Facebook pages. They make excuses for it. So what do we do? Well, I'm also a unionist, a fourth generation unionist. So I'm not really in the habit of breaking unions. I think once we go down that road, that's going to come back to bite us in the ass. What we have to do is we have to limit their political power and to make it clear that they're not part of our labor movement. So the Labor Federation in Seattle just voted to exclude the local police union from the local labor council. And I think that should happen across the country. They should be taken out of the AFL-CIO, those that are in it. Most are not even in it. They don't even want to be part of our labor movement. Yeah. We should sever as many ties with them as we can. But more importantly, I think we have to neutralize their political influence on elected officials. Yeah. And the way to do that is to make their endorsements and contributions politically toxic. We have to expose every politician who takes that cop money and that cop endorsement and say that that person cannot be our friend anymore. That's it. We're done with you. Because by accepting that money, you're embracing a racist politics designed to keep our communities incarcerated and brutalized. Because that's what that cop money is about. It's not about getting 2% on their pension. It's about enabling a whole right-wing ideology that says the only thing those people understand are handguns and ticket books and handcuffs and batons. And that's a racist worldview.
So I have been struck by how often it seems like local politicians are afraid of police. I can think of a few instances across the country where it seemed like mayors and governors, and that they are so hesitant to call a thing and say that was violent or that was wrong or that was stupid. Is it because of the political power that those unions wield?
I think it's important, right, to understand that it's not just the members of the union, that these unions have become a kind of institutional home for a whole set of really conservative right-wing politics. So white homeowners groups and gated communities, and also elite interests, downtown real estate interests, right? They also embrace this ideology. And so the union speaks for them as well in many ways. And so that's what politicians are afraid of. And we have to just point out how rancid and racist this politics is at every turn, not just to neutralize the police union membership, but all those people who are in line with it.
So for me, when you mention right-wing politics, that concerns me as a Black person and as a woman, because we know that racism and misogyny animate so much of that stuff. And something that I do worry about is that we divest from police and we build up these new institutions and we put it in communities, or we broaden social services, and that the racism that is currently in the police system, and also currently in a lot of social work and all that kind of stuff, and the sexism that's there, that it's simply recreated, that we are just reproducing the kinds of marginalization that we're trying to get away from by abolishing policing. How do you think that we might be able to avoid some of that?
Yeah, this is really important, right? We all know the history of social work in denying women benefits because they find, a man's toothbrush or razor in the bathroom, and their role in, pressuring women around birth control and things like this. So there's obviously reason for concern here. I think part of it has to be that this does not come as a kind of pre-packaged top-down program telling communities what they need. That this has to be a bottom-up movement of communities demanding what they think will work, and that they have some say in how these things are implemented. And that we're hiring people from the community to do this work. I think that's important. I mean, there are going to be problems. It's not going to be perfect. There are going to be high school counselors who turn out to be jerks, So it's not going to be perfect, but I think it's a lot better than relying on armed police.
Yeah. I think that what you mentioned earlier about we're not going to flip a switch one day and all police are going to be magically gone, like thinking of this more as a process can be really helpful there.
Yes. Yes, and it's about, not just bringing those social workers that people have to deal with when they need a child care voucher out into the community. It's about creating new institutions and new structures and hiring new people and creating new missions, right, for those folks that are really rooted in community safety, not in, micromanaging the poor.
Yeah. So can we talk about funding? Because I just read this book called Decriminalizing Domestic Violence by Lee Goodmark, which was so interesting. And she talked about how after the passage of the Violence Against Women Act, and also after the passage of the 1994 crime bill, both authored by Joe Biden, by the way, gave hundreds of millions of dollars to police. And the outcomes have been just bad, like really not good for women of any race when it comes to domestic violence, and like catastrophic when it comes to Black communities about the crime bill. So much of these conversations are still about money, more money, new money, whatever. Why does giving police money not work?
Well, first, let me say that Lee has written a great book and really encourage people to take a look at it. And also, Beth Ritchie's book, Arrested Justice, that really talks about how turning domestic violence over to the criminal justice system is not helping women, especially Black women.
Yeah.
And Lee has spent decades working in the domestic violence field trying to help women, and she says the criminal justice system is not helping these women, and we need these alternatives. So every dollar that we, let's talk about this on the federal level for a minute, since you mentioned VAWA and the 94 crime bill. What that did is it subsidized this process of mass criminalization. It poured billions of dollars into policing and prisons. It incentivized states to make drug laws harsher, to end probation and parole programs. And the Violence Against Women Act took what had been primarily a community-based movement run by women and turned it over to the criminal justice system and said, you can only have money if you cooperate with the courts and you become integrated into the parole system and the probation system, and that you inform on people to the police, and right, which killed the credibility of these programs, just made it an extension of criminalization. So one of the things that's being talked about now, and there's a national movement, the People's Coalition for Safety and Freedom, that includes a lot of important national groups like Law for Black Lives and the Center for Popular Democracy and the Advancement Project. They're calling for a complete reversal of the 94 crime bill. Instead of subsidizing school policing, we should be subsidizing school counselors and restorative justice programs. Instead of turning domestic violence into a criminal justice issue, we should be funding all these community-based initiatives that would give women and families resources, ideally to keep families together, right? Most people want their family to work.
Right.
They don't want their partner to be brutalized and criminalized. They want the family to work. But the Violence Against Women Act is just about criminalizing people and tearing these families apart, which is why women don't call the police.
Yeah.
Because it's not helping them. So what can we do to shift the resources out of policing and into actually helping these families?
Yeah.
And there is a bill that's being discussed by folks like Ayanna Pressley and Omar Ilhan and some of the other more progressive members of Congress that would propose doing exactly this.
So keeping along the path of how women are affected by this, a lot of the conversation about abolishing the police and defunding the police and moving away from policing as an institution, it often centers Black men and Black boys. And the chapter in your book that I was really, really struck by was chapter 4. It's called "We Called for Help and They Killed My Son." And we often don't hear the stories of Black women who call the police because they want help for somebody in their family. They call the police because something is happening inside of their home. And the police, because they are a violence institution, as you mentioned, they escalate and often kill and maim. So could we talk just a little bit about how Black women in their homes and in their communities are so negatively impacted by the way that the police function?
It's such a huge problem. I mean, in overall, between 1.25% of all people killed by police in the United States are having a mental health crisis. And of course, this burden falls disproportionately on those communities that can't afford high quality health care, that don't have a mental health component to their health insurance, or don't have any health insurance at all and rely on emergency rooms and state hospitals. So this is, even if the police say, well, we just go where the calls are, but there's a reason the calls are concentrated in these places, because they already are at a disadvantage. Yeah. And so we've told these families that when there's a crisis, they got to call 911. They don't have a primary care physician. They don't have a community-based mental health clinic that can handle problems in the middle of the night. And a lot of these families don't have access to good ongoing quality care that would prevent a crisis from happening in the first place. Jumaane Williams, who's the elected public advocate in New York City, issued a report recently that lays out a plan for getting police out of the mental health business. And it starts with creating real community-based mental health care facilities, drop-in centers, regular primary mental health care. And then if someone has a crisis, a high quality 24/7 crisis response unit capacity that doesn't rely on armed police, where they can go and deal with this as clinicians, including dealing with situations which are volatile.
Yeah.
Because, you know, using guns and tasers is not the only possible way of dealing with someone who's acting out. And often when we introduce someone with a badge and a gun, we actually further destabilize that situation. We make the situation worse. Better someone who can come in low threat, no one's getting arrested, no one's getting shot, no one's going to be able to commit suicide by cop, which is what the cops always say. Well, we didn't have any choice. He picked up a gun, we had to kill him. That's only because the person knows that if they call 911, someone with a gun is going to come and shoot them if they want them to.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right? So we just got to break that whole dynamic down.
So I'm gonna revisit this because this is the big thing. Anytime we talk about this, people have been so upset about, okay, so we get rid of policing. Are you not worried about the serial rapists that are walking down the street? Are you not worried about the serial murderer?
Of course I'm worried. That's the whole point of this movement. We're worried that we're not doing a good job of catching those serial murderers and rapists now. We need something that's better. Now, we don't know exactly what all of these strategies are going to look like. What is producing that behavior in the first place? That isn't behavior that just falls out of the sky from nowhere. You know, remember I said before, people who commit violence have been the victims of violence. That's true in these cases as well. Right? These are folks whose lives have been powerfully disordered by violence and abuse. And by limiting our approach to the criminal justice system, we wait until these things become so out of hand that so many people have been harmed that it seems like, well, the only option is to put them in a cage. But where were the earlier interventions? I mean, almost everyone who gets caught eventually doing these horrible things, this is not the first time someone said, this person is a risk. There's something scary about this person. But nothing was done because they weren't caught in the act by the police and because there was no other way to respond. Look at school shootings. Almost every single school shooting, there were people who suspected that this person was going to do something. But there was no system in place to do anything about it. Sometimes the cops got called and they went to someone's house, but what could they do? There's nothing they can do because they only get involved after the harm has been done.
Yeah. I mean, that you just touched on something that I try to reiterate to people all of the time, particularly when it comes to domestic violence situations, is unfortunately when we see those stories about people who have been killed, we talked about school shootings, when we talk about women who are killed by their partners, those women have often done exactly what they are told to do when they're scared. Our police does not prevent violence. It might postpone violence, it might postpone harm, but it is not really meaningfully intervening in the cycle that causes people to be killed.
It's not fixing it, right? It's not fixing it. And those killings are never the first incident. There's always a long trail that's leading up to that. And where were the interventions earlier in the process?
So to wrap it up, I don't know if this is a moment, I don't know if this is a movement, but something is happening. How do you feel about the prospects that we might actually be on the brink of a broad social transformation and moving away from policing as we traditionally know it?
Well, you know, it is a moment, it is an opening, but we've got to move from just street protests. I mean, we got to keep the street protests going. That's the only reason we're having this moment, right? But we also have to take that energy and we have to turn it into real political power. And that means we got to, you know, not just occupy streets, we got to occupy City Hall. We got to occupy city council offices. We've also got to take more control over our communities. You know, we've got to occupy those neighborhood meetings. We got to occupy those precinct community council meetings. You know, we got to be there saying we've got a better vision for our community. And ultimately, that's going to require community organizing, because we can't win this in abstract debates. We got to convince our neighbors right next door that we have a better strategy for keeping them safe.
Yeah.
And that means we got to talk to people, you know, one-on-one, and do that hard work. That's what we learned from the labor movement, right? Unions get formed and develop power because they go out and they talk to each member one-on-one and address their concerns and involve them in the process. And we got to do that at the community level too, as much as we can.
Yeah. Well, that's all I have. Thank you so much for taking some time, Professor Vitale. I really appreciate it.
Great conversation. I really enjoyed it.
Yeah, have a good day. And again, I appreciate you for squeezing me in. Thank you. And also, the end of policing is great. I don't think it's like nobody can find it, so I've just been sending people the PDF. I hope that's fine.
It's free right now. It's free to download. They can download it themselves for free on versobooks.com. We've made it free. There've been over 200,000 free downloads of the book. And the print copies, some more have arrived and more will be coming. So if you're one of those people who likes to write in your book, you know, it's an inexpensive book and more copies are coming.
Well, thank you. Have a great rest of your day.
You bet. You too.
Yeah.